two, one, two, three.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Teresa Ault. Today, I'm here with John Monkovich, and we're going to be talking about the possibility of a bigger pilot for Ithaca. We will see what that means. John is a member of DSA, of Ithaca DSA, and also was a Cornell student and is now a Cornell employee. So, John, what is a pilot?
Yeah, so the acronym PILOT stands for payments in lieu of taxes. A pilot concerns Cornell and the city of Ithaca, since Cornell University is, by New York state law, a property tax exempt institution. In fact, a tax-exempt institution more broadly. That leaves a really big burden on the city budget and on other city taxpayers. But pilots are really a kind of predominantly northeastern of the US phenomenon where we have a lot of these legacy eds and meds or educational and medical institutions that don't really serve the public good, that are leaving big holes in the budgets of college towns or other municipalities, and there is no legal mechanism to tax those institutions. And so we have a kind of voluntary agreement that is arranged between the institution and the municipality in question that is kind of outside of the formal law. Now, I said they're voluntary. They're not. That doesn't mean that they're not contested. They certainly are hotly contested much of the time. But for a kind of layperson, I guess the way I describe a pilot is it's a way to tax the rich or tax rich institutions, even when currently the law doesn't provide you the right to do so.
In fact, I'd like to go back and maybe take apart something that you said, institutions that don't serve the public good. And I think here there's a little more. People will say, but Cornell, all that research is beneficial. Well, some of it's beneficial, some of it may be detrimental. But one thing that is contrast Cornell as an educational institution now with a city public school as an educational institution. It's perfectly clear that a local, and I shouldn't call it a city public school because actually cities do not run schools in New York State for the most part. I think it's a little different in New York City, but there are school districts. Oddly, the Ithaca City School District is quite different, quite separate from the city of Ithaca. It includes the city of Ithaca. It includes parts of other towns. It even includes a little slice of a neighboring county. The point is that the local property taxes that go to fund the Ithaca City School District serve the children living in the same area. And so, sure, a school in Ithaca might be a nice piece of property, but it shouldn't be taxed. It shouldn't be paying a property tax, or it doesn't have to. But Cornell serves people from all over the country, in fact, all over the world. It's a very international institution, but the taxes, the property taxes that it doesn't have to pay fall entirely on the population of the city of Ithaca, or I should say, in this case, the Ithaca City School District. Well, both. So it causes problems for local education, and it causes problems for running the city, including the streets that people have to drive over to get to Cornell. I don't so much question national tax benefits that Cornell has, but I do question the local ones. It's not like a local school or a local church or the free clinic downtown or something like that. So getting back to the theme of payments in lieu of taxes, pilots, payments in place of taxes instead of taxes, how much of the city's current budget does the currently existing pilot provide?
Firstly, I forgot to mention that we're talking about a bigger pilot for Ithaca because finally, after over 20 years, the current agreement is set to expire in June of 2024, which is not too far away. So in the final year of that agreement, which we're upon now, Cornell will be paying the city of Ithaca $1.5 million, of which 900,000 is set aside specifically for fire protection services. Now, that is a small sliver of the 35 to 40, potentially more than that, million that Cornell would pay in taxes if they weren't tax exempt. And that's because Cornell actually owns the majority of property or property value in the city of Ithaca, literally over 50%. So again, that's quite a burden that they're passing on. And to put that kind of 35 or $40 million number in greater context, that would be nearing, well, the city budget has increased recently, but it would be nearing half of our current city budget, which is just, is too much to even imagine, what things would look like. I mean, what our city budget would look like, or what kind of how we might radically reimagine our city budget if that amount of money was coming in as it should be.
Yeah, wow, we might get better plowed streets,
For a start,
better,
yeah.
maybe even sidewalks. So a large part of it is fire. Actually, I remember the days of the first pilot, you might say, the 1990s, and there was a lot of talk about how the Ithaca City Fire Department was spending a lot of time, putting out a lot of energy, responding to false alarms. Now, I think there was a bit of an urban legend, you might say, a not quite true thing. People said, oh, the naughty students are pulling false alarms. And I'm sure this happened a few times, but I was working on campus in the late 80s, and I remember a lot of false alarms that were fire drills for us. And it kind of turned out gradually we were in a building that was very new at that time. In fact, we'd been moved in before it was really finished, Snee Hall. And we would stand outside in the cold, but enjoying a little break from our jobs and waiting to be allowed back in again. And again, it was a false alarm. And people were muttering somebody was smoking near a smoke detector. And then eventually they figured out, no, what was happening was that construction workers were doing what they're supposed to do and drilling, install things that hadn't been installed before we moved in. And that was setting off some plaster dust. And the plaster dust was getting into the smoke, the particle detectors, and setting them off. I have no idea whether this may in the newer buildings be happening for all I know these days. But at any rate, it was sort of one more example of how Cornell's desire to hurry things up for its own purposes was causing expenses to the city. This was, as I said, the late 80s. So how come we have a pilot now? Let's put it this way.
Yeah, well, you could probably speak to that a lot better than I can, having been here during that period. I guess I'll give you a little on-ramp, which was that there was some interesting kind of legislative efforts by some socialists in office at the time.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay, yes, I do remember, because from that job at Cornell, I moved to a job in City Hall when Ben Nichols was mayor. And actually, I was looking back this morning, but finding remarkably little about this, except that at the very beginning of his term in 1990, he appointed a Cornell and City Relations Commission. And I do remember that the chair of it was Mary Jo Dudley, that there was at least one Ithaca DSA member on it, Steve Emmerman. And they spent a couple of years looking into this question, doing, I think, the kind of research that you are doing right now. And a couple of years later, probably 93 or 94, I do not remember precisely, they issued a report. That report should be in the city's archives. I don't think that I have it. And then the city started negotiating with Cornell. That is to say, Ben and I think really the president of Cornell got into negotiations.
mhm.
And that went kind of dragged. And finally, Ben, to, bring things to a halt, Ben worked with the building department of the city to stop issuing building permits. Well, that did bring action. Alas, I think it was also Ben's downfall. He had failed to communicate sufficiently with the building trades. And they were up in arms on the side of Cornell. I'm not at all sure that it would be the same now. But I think at that time, Cornell had a deal with the building trades that they would use union labor. They have more recently tried to dodge that. So that's something to look into. So finally, an agreement was signed. And that was 1995. It was had to be renegotiated about a decade later. And that second one, I think, is what's coming to an end now, if I'm not mistaken.
I think there's a lot that interests me about, I guess, from like an organizing perspective or kind of strategy perspective about what went right and what went wrong about that period and how we can learn from it.
Yeah.
And similarly, what we can learn, this was a big kind of legislative priority of former Mayor Svante Myrick as well. I've learned from reading about it. I wasn't here at the time. And this was his big kind of his big push was to bring Cornell to the table and to get a more progressive pilots agreement. And he did his own kind of big research report in the kind of maybe 2012 to 2014 period, and it was published in local papers. There's a lot of attention and energy around it at the time, and at least behind closed doors, and ultimately it didn't really come to anything. What's really exciting about this opportunity we have now with the agreement actually coming to an end is we have that ultimate form of leverage, which is that the agreement actually just needs to be renegotiated. I suppose at the time, Cornell might have told Mayor Myrick that, well, we're going to let this agreement come to its end, and we'll renegotiate it when that's over. So we're going to delay you about another 10 years. I think what's interesting to me is that this was, his big priority, it seemed, or one of them. But there wasn't a real grassroots mobilization, it seems, that he could call upon when things did get stalled behind closed doors. And maybe that's partially true of Mayor Nichols as well. And of course, it is not an easy thing to build that kind of community support and energy
Yeah.
around you. But it's interesting to me, it will be interesting to me to see whether that might be possible over this next year, and what role DSA might have in that.
Yeah, interesting. How does what we have now compare with other places, other university towns?
Yeah, well, across primarily the Northeast, at a lot of, notable, shall we say, private institutions, other, uh, you know, community members just like us have paid notice to the same issue of, these universities being hedge funds with schools attached and not really giving their fair share locally, being exempt from property tax, and what a burden that is, for cities and college towns and whatnot. And so, in short, we're quite far behind. Maybe we weren't back in the day, but with this 20+ year agreement, we certainly have fallen behind uh, as communities, around these other primarily universities, have mobilized and won, in the tens of million, well, in the single digit, or single 10 or tens of millions, with pilot negotiations of their own. It differs across the board, in depending on what city you're talking about. There have been kind of prolonged struggles for this in Baltimore and Philadelphia and Boston, Rhode Island, and so on. And in many cases, we see kind of quite advanced pilot programs, like in Boston, where they actually have like kind of citywide program that applies to many big nonprofits, not just a single university. But in actuality, because it's not a legally binding agreement, certain universities, Harvard, for example, have kind of slowly just begun not paying the full amount that they were supposed to pay, and have been getting away with it for now, at least. There are some attempts to solve that problem through more legislation, but I'm not quite sure exactly where those are. Cornell and Ithaca are an interesting example because, compared to even many of those cities, our property tax situation is quite quite exceptional. We're a smaller city than many of those, and Cornell dominates more of our city than peer institutions do in other places. And so there's a real argument that not only does this new pilot negotiation need to catch up, but it needs to actually surpass what has been achieved in lots of other cities. And so I think the expectation should be that we're seeing a really, really significant boost to Cornell's contribution in the tens of millions. And I don't see why our ask to start with shouldn't be that they pay 100% of what they owe.
Wow, that would be something. There has been some places or some institutions have pilots, but they don't want to call them pilots. Do you know anything about that issue? Is that likely to crop up here?
I do know a bit, and that actually applies to us as
Oh,
well. Um, Cornell contends that what we have currently is not a pilot, and they refer to it simply as an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, which is just a kind of, financial agreement. Uh, and I can't remember exactly. I mean, I think it's just that they don't want to kind of set a precedent uh,
yeah.
that they are responsible for paying in lieu of taxes. They don't want to acknowledge the fact that there's even this tax that they're escaping. So I think reframing it as an MOU allows them to reframe it as something more charitable. Um, though I'm not totally sure.
Yeah.
And I definitely expect Cornell in this next year to bring the fight on this issue once again.
Well, a lot of pilots are actually have a kind of legal standing. Um, the Industrial Development Agency, I think, is in charge of setting pilots, and they will set a, there are, for instance, I think the Hancock Street housing. This is a not for profit that has housing for low income people. Something that you might expect to be publicly provided, and
Hmm.
yet they pay, and so it is very reasonable for them to be tax exempt as a not for profit, but also they actually pay a payment in lieu of taxes to the city, and I guess to the school district and whatnot, the county. Yeah, and what could Cornell do? There is a Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, fought back by apparently either actually or threatening to withdraw community services that they were doing. So it might behoove us to, you know, assume that Cornell will think of this too, and they are always touting how much community service they give, but it's not always clear how big that is. I mean, I've run into little examples. I remember, again, from City Hall days, a actually, I remember one very skilled city planner who worked with the city, helped the city out very nicely. And I remember another one, presumably an analogous kind of arrangement, who wasn't all that useful.
Hmm. Yeah, it's certainly something that we can expect Cornell to fight back with from a narrative perspective. There's been an attempt in a couple of different pilot struggles to put a number on what the price of all the community services that the institution in question provides,
Uh-huh.
um, which I think is kind of backwards. I mean, um, not only is that really difficult to do, but there's something just very odd about putting a price on the volunteering that students end up doing in the local community, um, as if that's not of their own volition, for example. Um,
Volunteering or resume stuffing.
right. Um, and in some agreements, they a certain kind of proportion of the contribution can be kind of set aside as the price of the community services that are already provided. So it might say, oh, you're gonna pay, 25% of the property tax that you owe. And of that 25%, you are allowed to already consider the community benefits that you provide. So you don't have to pay that amount because you're already providing that value. So it's a kind of way for universities and other entities to negotiate down what they owe. And so it's a kind of, slick trick that we should be mindful of.
Yeah. By the way, I think one important fact in all this, what is the size of Cornell's endowment?
Yes, it is over $10 billion now.
10, say that
Billion,
clearly,
10 billion.
billion with a B.
Yes. And notably also the operating budget of Cornell on an annual basis is over $5 billion.
Wow. So there is a lot of money there, although I have also heard firsthand that some of the, while some of the students have loads of money, other students do not and can hardly afford to eat.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so, well, this has been some very interesting background into issues that will be developing over the next 2 years. Thank you, John Monkovich. We will come back to this again and again, I am sure. This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. Thanks for watching.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.